Today we are doing Unit 5, which is Cognitive. It used to be Units 7 and 11. There's a ton of stuff in this. Ordinarily it's very activity heavy in class, which makes it a lot of fun. But since we need to do this pretty quick, we're pretty much going to be walking through terms. So I just have, I compiled the Unit 7a blank terms, Unit 7b blank terms, and then also the Unit 11 terms, and I made it into this big old document, and I'm just going to be walking through it. So that's all we're doing today, and then there'll also be the quiz. So encoding is putting things into memory. Storage is keeping it in your memory. Retrieval is taking it out of memory. And then memory is broken up into a few different time distances. And it's not what you would think, although all of you have had class before, so you know what the difference between these things is. Sensory is the shortest, followed by short term. Sensory, there are several different kinds of sensory memory, but sensory is between much less than a second to like 2 or 3 seconds, so very short and very accurate. Short-term memory is 20 to 30 seconds, and it is also called working memory. I need to just make it short-term / working, but short-term memory and working memory, at least to my knowledge, are virtually the same thing. And then long-term memory. Long-term memory is anything that stays in your memory, and it is after short-term memory, so it's oddly enough from about 30 seconds long to years and years, decades. Parallel processing is your ability to do multiple things at once. So right now, like I can drink coffee, and that means hold it upright so I don't spill it, and talk. And I could even, I know how to, I could juggle at the same time. All that would be pretty easy. I can walk and talk at the same time. Your mind's ability to do multiple things at once. Automatic versus effortful processing. Automatic processing is basically putting things into memory without even having to try, without having conscious effort. And effortful would be intending to put things into memory. So like if you're having to memorize all 50 state capitals, effortful processing. You're actually having to think to yourself, that's the capital city of this state, as opposed to automatic, where it's automatic. Like when you drive to McGinnis, you probably don't even have to think about where you're going. It's just automatic. As well as when you learn things without intending to learn them, it just over repetition, it automatically kind of gets absorbed. Rehearsal is one strategy for putting things into long-term memory. It's a fairly poor one, but it's saying things over and over. Like if you are trying to memorize someone's phone number and you say the phone number over and over, a license plate over and over, then that would be rehearsal. Spacing effect says that if you have a limited, it's better to space out studying, and it is better for memory than it is if you chunk it all together. Even if you only have 1 hour to study, it's better if you do it in 2 chunks of 30 minutes. Or maybe even, there's probably a limit to it, maybe even better 20 minutes, rather than 1 hour altogether. But it says, generally speaking, if you space things out, study for 2 days instead of 1 day, even if it's the same amount of time, it's better to space things out. Serial position effect. When memorizing items in a list, you tend to remember the first and last items more. We did this activity in class with the sleep terms, where I gave you all the terms relating to sleep, and then pumpkin was in the middle, if that rings any bells. But the recency effect specifically of the serial position effect is you remember the last items in a list more than the middle items, and the primacy is you remember the first word or words in a list. Also, like if you're going to a party, you might remember the first person you meet at a party and the last person, but not so much the middle people. There are 3 types of encoding. Semantic is engaging with the meaning of something. It's the best one. We did an activity. I split the room in half, and I had the smart side and the dumb side. The smart side did semantic encoding of the riddles. The dumb side did acoustic encoding of the riddles. Acoustic would just be listening, but not cognitively engaging with. Like in that case, it was how well does this poem rhyme, or how much of a tongue twister is it, and that would be acoustic encoding. Visual encoding is just looking at something and how well that goes into memory. So if with a textbook, if you're studying for a textbook, if you're actually like visualizing what's happening in the textbook, that would be semantic encoding, engaging with meaning. That's the best way to memorize. Acoustic encoding, I guess, would be like listening to an audio book or reading it out loud, which would be worse than semantic. And then visual, at least our textbook says that visual is the worst, and that would be just reading the words without actually like cognitively giving it much effort. Imagery is a type of recall from the senses. So like if you can visualize what it smelled like to be in class last time you were in class, that would be imagery. Mnemonics is a memory aid, so there's a lot of ways that you can help remember things like Roy G. Biv, like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet for the colors of the rainbow. That's not my phone number, but chunking is that it's easy to remember the first one that is the second one. So it's easy to remember things in manageable chunks rather than, in this case, a string of digits. But it would be much easier to remember this in that chunk, that chunk, that chunk, rather than this whole thing, even though it's the same amount of information. Iconic and echoic memory are both types of sensory memory. Iconic memory is visual sensory memory. So if you close your eyes, you have a very small fraction of a second of iconic memory, which is visual sensory memory for a short amount of time, and it's very accurate. Echoic memory, I'm not really sure how iconic memory is very useful, but echoic memory is kind of useful, and that's for 2, 3, 4 seconds. You have very good recall of what was just previously said. And the cool thing is, it's even if you're not paying attention. So if your mom says, what did I just say to you? Even if you aren't paying attention, you can still recall the last sentence she said because of echoic memory. Long-term potentiation is neuronal connections are strengthened the more they are used. So there's a phrase I've heard, neurons that fire together wire together, and that seems to be true. Like the more you practice the piano, the better you get at the piano, because the neurons that are involved in the piano create more connections and are strengthened. A flashbulb memory is a very vivid memory of a dramatic event. It's actually not necessarily accurate, but it is very strong memory. It'd be like, well, you all are too young, but 9/11. But when the Pope was elected, you probably knew exactly what you were doing. When you got the news, a lot of coronavirus stuff, you're probably going to remember the day the world shut down. What was that, March 14th or something like that? You'll be able to remember what school felt like the day before spring break. Amnesia is the loss of long-term memory, and it can be because of several different things. It can be because of disease or psychological illness, anything like that. In the case of repression, it would be because of a traumatic event. Implicit memory and explicit memory. Implicit memory is memory that you can automatically recall without even any conscious effort, and explicit memory is memory that actually has to be thought about in order to recall it. Implicit memory, if you play music, you probably can, some of the pieces that you've memorized, it might actually even mess you up to think about it too much. You just kind of got to relax and just do it based on muscle memory and just automatic, and that would be more implicit memory. Or when you're driving to school, you find yourself not even thinking at all, and you can't even remember how you got to school. But explicit memory would be having to try to remember what the capital of North Dakota is. Hippocampus is the area of the limbic system involved in memory. Recall is retrieving items from long-term memory. Recognition is the feeling of familiarity you get when something is remembered based on a contextual cue. Relearning is literally learning, again, relearning, and it is easier to learn the second time. Priming is creating unconscious associations, which is a lot of what advertising does. When you see a billboard for something and then you're in the grocery aisle, you're more likely to buy that thing based on having seen the billboard before. It primes unconscious positive associations. Deja vu is the feeling that something's happened before. You're not actually able to predict the future as an event is happening, but as the event is happening, you feel as if you could predict what's going to happen next. Deja vu is the feeling that something's happened before. Mood congruent memory is when you remember something, you actually store an emotion along with the event that you're remembering. And when you, like if you remember a vacation, you tend to remember other happy things as well. And when you think of bad things that happened, a breakup or something, you tend to, other negative things also tend to come to mind. Deja vu is the feeling that something's happened before. Proactive interference and retroactive interference, two types of learning that can interfere with either previous or future learning. Proactive interference is when old learning makes new learning more difficult, and retroactive is the opposite direction. So it'd be like if you learned Spanish in elementary school and then you're learning French in high school. Proactive interference would be the French is harder to learn because you've already learned the Spanish and you just keep thinking of the Spanish words when you're supposed to be learning the French words. Retroactive would be the exact opposite. So it'd be once you learn French in high school, it makes it harder to remember the Spanish because all you can think of is the French. Repression is the blocking out of uncomfortable memories. So something traumatic happens and it's blocked from memory. The misinformation effect is remembering things inaccurately, usually based on some information you received after an event happened. For instance, if you witnessed a car wreck in the McGinnis parking lot, it would be best to tell exactly what happened right then to take a statement. But if you then hear other students talking about the car wreck, that can actually influence your memory that you witnessed of the car wreck also. Source amnesia is just remembering something but not remembering where you learned that thing from. Cognition is just the process of acquiring knowledge. A concept is like a grouping of objects, so you can have the concept of car, and that would include all cars inside of the concept of car. Prototype is the easiest example of a concept to think of. So if you say the concept of car, I would think of like a Honda Civic, just a generic car, as a concept, which would be a prototype. Or if you say like coffee shop, the prototype of coffee shop might be Starbucks. Two ways to solve problems: algorithm and heuristic. Heuristic is a shortcut in thinking. It is less accurate, but it saves time. It's not necessarily bad. It can be bad. In fact, it's what leads to stereotypes, but it also can be very beneficial. Algorithm is a step-by-step, slower but more accurate way to solve a problem. There are two types of heuristics. The representative heuristic is overusing prototypes. So the prototype of a McGinnis student might be, especially if you don't go to McGinnis, the prototype of a McGinnis student might be a really rich kid. And that would be and if you tend to think everybody at McGinnis is probably a rich kid, then that would be using the representative heuristic. It would be overusing prototypes or the stereotype. Availability heuristic is overestimating things that easily come to mind, usually because they're dramatic. So we tend to be more afraid of dying in a tornado than we are of a car wreck, even though a car wreck is much more common. But tornadoes, we can easily think of the last bad tornado that happened, so it's easily accessible in our mind. I found this picture for framing. Framing is the order of presenting information tends to impact how you think about information. So this is the exact same thing, but would you want frozen yogurt that contains 20% fat? That sounds terrible. Or frozen yogurt that's 80% fat-free. Means the exact same thing, but the way it's framed is different, and that impacts the way you view this yogurt. Insight is the sudden solution to a problem. So it's the moment in math class where you finally get it. Creativity is the ability to come up with new solutions to a problem, new novel solutions, maybe thinking outside the box. Expertise, you all know what this is, but it's just knowing an extensive amount about a specific subject. Being functionally fixated would mean that you have a desire to do things the way they are intended to be done. It can be if you have to undo a light plate and you need a Phillips screwdriver. You could use a Phillips screwdriver, but if you don't have one, you could also use other things like you'd use your thumbnail, and that would not be being functionally fixated. Also, you might have seen with the coronavirus, the masks, there's galleries of people using really like milk jugs, shoes, dog cones as masks, and that they would not be functionally fixated, to their credit. Mental set is related to functional fixation. It's seeing only the solutions that have worked for you in the past. Confirmation bias is placing more cognitive weight on evidence that confirms what you already believe than what disagrees with your personal beliefs. You can make big examples of coronavirus. People that think that coronavirus is Well, you can think all over the place. Think it's more deadly than people are saying. Some people think it's less deadly than people are saying. Some people think the thoughts go all over the place, and you can read articles that will give evidence for kind of whatever you want to believe about it. And if you read an article and it is in the direction of what you want to believe about coronavirus, if you really believe that article and give a lot of cognitive weight to that article, that would be confirmation bias. And then if you read an article that disagrees with what you think and you dismiss the article, confirmation bias. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation we already actually did, but it's doing something, being motivated to do something because you actually enjoy doing it, which would be intrinsic motivation, or because you have some external reward for doing it, which would be extrinsic motivation. Overconfidence. Humans tend to, when they are asked a question and they give an answer, and you say, how sure are you in your answer? They tend to be more sure of their answer than they ought to be. Belief perseverance is also, as humans, we tend to not change our minds very much, which is part of why religious people will stay religious, atheists tend to stay atheists, Catholics stay Catholics, Protestants stay Protestants, Republicans tend to stay Republican, Democrats stay Democrat, and independents stay independent. It's belief perseverance. It's very hard to change someone's mind about things. Intuition is immediately kind of understanding things without even consciously knowing why you understand it. Language. One of the things that makes us human and animals is because we have language, or at least a complex language. Phonemes are the most basic unit of language. They are individual sounds within a language. So phonemes, like an individual sound like d, o, s, they're all phonemes. Morphemes are the smallest unit of language that actually has meaning. So the ed sound at the end of the word walk would be a morpheme because it means you walked in the past. The s sound would be both a phoneme and a morpheme because if you add it at the end of a noun, it becomes a plural noun. So it has meaning and it is one individual piece of language. Grammar is the set of rules for language or making sentences. Syntax is how words are ordered inside of a sentence, which is different in English and some other languages. Now we get to development, which is actually the next whole unit, but in this case, language development. And these are pretty self-explanatory, but the first stage of development would be the babbling stage. That's not actually words, just babbling. One word stage would be able to say individual words, but not actual sentences, but maybe say like ball or dada. Two word stage would be like very simple sentences, and the telegraphic speech is still small sentences, but more complex subjects and verbs. Skinner, who did operant conditioning, came up with these three things of how people learn language. Association, which is associating a word with an object. Imitation, which where the child will imitate what their parents or other older friends say or do. And then reinforcement is that kind of behavior is praise or, oh yeah, that is a ball. Chomsky, another developmental theorist, said that we have a inborn universal grammar, meaning that as humans, there's this language isn't completely made up. It almost has an inherent realism to it that can be known. It is born within us. We don't entirely learn it from scratch. Critical periods are the concept that there is a ideal time period to learn something. For instance, language. We all watched the video of Jeannie Wiley, who was the girl that was found at I think 12 years old, and she'd been extremely neglected and hadn't learned English, and she was not really able to learn at that point. She had missed the critical period for learning when it was best to learn, much younger than that. The Whorf Hypothesis is that our understanding of the world is shaped by the language that we use. One example of this would be like English. We have a kind of constricted understanding of love because of our language. We have one word for love as opposed to the Greek words for love where they have multiple words for love. It sounds silly that you can say you love your wife or husband and you love your best friend and you love cheesecake. And those are all true, but we use the same word, which is a little constricting in that sense. Moving on to what used to be Unit 11. Factor analysis is a statistical technique to tease out individual variables. For intelligence tests or personality tests, you would use something like factor analysis to avoid overlapping questions, or overlapping outcome variables. Savant Syndrome would be someone with a very low general intelligence but an extremely high ability in one specific area. Think all of my AP Psych classes, I have you all come up with your own intelligences, so if you remember that, we did that on the board. But Robert Sternberg came up with 3 that he had. There's also some other person came up with 8 intelligences. He came up with 3. He said there is analytical intelligence, which is more what you'd think of as intelligence. There's creative intelligence, and that would be just being able to think outside the box, music, art, things like that. And then practical intelligence, which would be, I guess, what you might call street smarts. Emotional intelligence is the ability to regulate your emotions. So you can manage your own emotions. You can sense other people's emotions. Some people have high emotional intelligence. Some people aren't able to regulate their own emotions, and they aren't able to tell when someone else is very sad. And some people are very easily, they almost immediately notice when someone is upset. IQ literally stands for intelligence quotient. It used to be a quotient. It used to be a division, where you used to divide mental age by chronological age, multiply by 100, and that would be your IQ. IQ from these 2 tests are set, they're standardized so that the average IQ is 100, and the standard deviation is 15. So if you are 1 standard deviation above the mean IQ, your IQ would be 150. Also, 2 standard deviations above or below is where your gifted and intellectually disabled begins. So 70 and below is intellectually disabled, and 130 and above is intellectually gifted. The Stanford Binet and Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC, are 2 just commonly done intelligence tests. 2 types of tests. Achievement tests, which just test your knowledge of a subject, like a test on the 50 state capitals would be an achievement test. An aptitude test would not ask you specific information that you need to recall. Its goal is to predict your ability to do something in the future. Standardization is transforming the results of a test into some sort of meaningful distribution, or even if I gave a final for this class and I wanted the average for my final to be 85 with a standard deviation of 5. I could do that. I just would I would take everyone's score and standardize it so that that was the case, which is what they do for IQ. So they want the average IQ score to be 100, so they can standardize it that way. The IQ distribution of IQ scores follows a normal curve, so more people fall within the first standard deviation of the mean, which is the case for any normal curve. And most people, the modal score, most commonly occurring score, would be the average score is 100. And then the farther away you get from the mean, the less people have that IQ score. So only 0.1% of people have an IQ above 145 or below 55. Reliability and validity. Reliability is the ability to get the same result time after time. And validity is that the result is actually measuring what you intend it to measure. 2 types of validity are content validity and predictive validity. Content validity would be that if I gave a final for this class, the content validity would be that the final covered all of the class and nothing outside of the class in roughly equal amounts. That would be good content validity. Predictive validity, the whole point of taking AP Psychology and passing the test is that it ought to be predictive of your ability to have done well in a college freshman level introductory psychology class. So supposedly, if it is true, a 5 means you could have gotten an A in an intro psych class, 4B, 3C, 2D, 1F. And if that is true, that means that the AP Psychology course is predictively valid. Intellectual disability is an IQ of 70 or below. And then nature nurtures the debate in basically every unit that we have of how much of, in this case, intelligence is because of your genetics and how much of it can be learned. And that's all for this unit. Sorry it was a little dry. There's really no way to do this, especially with the time crunch that we have, other than just to go through notes. So that's what we did. But next unit is developmental, and I'll see you then. Deja vu is the feeling that something's happened before,